day. We have clearly moved above $75 a barrel this morning out of Asia. Let's kick off with our regular Thursday morning commentator, Dr. Carole Nakhle, Chief Executive Officer of Crystol Energy. Carole, we had the Fed yesterday basically staying on the sidelines once again. Everything is fine. We're not going to do anything. What's your thoughts looking at their report yesterday?
Good morning, Sean. Good morning, everyone. Well, I think I'm improving my English language dictionary by following the Fed statements, their chairman, Powell, because he used the expression a ways away from really worrying about inflation as a structural problem and therefore reversing their policies. So we are getting more reassurance from the bank every time they meet that they are not ready to take any action. But the same thing, Sean, if I take another interesting data that emerged recently, that is from the IMF quarterly data forecast. The same thing there, if you look at the headline rates, for example, the IMF had kept its growth for global economy the same at 6% for everybody. But there was what the IMF warned of was of a compositional change. So we have to go beyond these headline news and look at the data in more detail. So while they upgraded their forecast for the richer countries, the developed economies, which we call the OECD, and they downgraded by the same percentage the developing economies. So we're finding that this kind of gap between the uneven growth and the multi-speed, if you remember, we mentioned that several times before, between the richer world and the poor world is getting bigger. And for me, it has direct implications on oil demand, because if you look at oil forecasts, you see that the main growth in demand is expected to come from the developing economies, the Asias of this world. And that, because this will be the growth engine center for oil demand in the future. Whereas in the OECD, oil demand peaked in 2006. So really, if we're having this kind of divergence in growth and economic performance growing between the richer world, where things seem to be quite rightly going in the right direction because of the access to vaccination, because of maintained government stimulus program and supportive monetary policy, versus the developing world, we're seeing a slowdown in economic growth, government reversing their policy. We see that the stimulus packages are being withdrawn, and they will suffer even more if the richer world increases their interest rate, because the cost of borrowing for them will increase. So while on the surface, definitely the chairman may be right in saying we are still a ways away from worrying and changing course of action, I think lots of moving parts are taking place elsewhere, which will have structural implications on oil markets in the future.
Let's leap across to the U.S. to Dr. Aldo Flores-Quiroga, former Deputy Secretary of Energy for Hydrocarbons at Mexico's Ministry of Energy. Dr. Aldo, welcome back. Thank you for joining us. We also see the U.S. inventory levels declining, although we had a sort of a counterintuitive upward move last week. This week we saw a return to form, another significant decline. Inventories are getting quite tight and moving well below now the 5-year average. Your outlook for the continuation of that, should the oil producers be pushing more oil into the market?
I think it's one more occasion in which producers have to take this very carefully. As I was thinking about our conversation, what would be today, I felt that we had been here before, that we continue to have this uncertainty about what's going to happen with demand, with the new rise in contagions and the Delta variant. So I think this is one of those situations, once again, which you have producers will have to take it slowly and monitor what happens, especially by the beginning of the fall. This is a very fast-moving situation, and it's hard to tell, at least for me, where exactly this is going. And after hearing Carole's review of what economic growth rates might be, it just strengthens that perspective.
Well, let's go across to China. Albert Stromquist, Principal Lanstrom Advisors. Albert, lovely to see you again. It's been a while. Thank you for joining us. One of the question marks on the demand side increasingly is, where is China going? Starting to look a little bit softer than most would have expected. Your thoughts on OPEC's decision to keep the market very tight? Maybe it's justified given China's outlook.
Well, good morning, Sean, and thank you very much. That's an excellent question because it's a very soft question with even softer answers, given the kind of veil of secrecy that China maintains around some of the key performance measures that you might otherwise expect to see. Yes, there is a softening. The global pundits, I think, are forecasting an 8.6% GDP for China this year. But China itself is targeting 6%, whether that's an accurate target or one for political purposes. But there is a gap in between what the world sees and what China believes it can do. Next year, 5.5%, and that's kind of the current consensus. So that's way off where the economy was 10 years ago and even 5 years ago. And that obviously translates into energy demand within China, notably in the manufacturing sector. And I think on my last visit, we also talked about the transportation sector, and particularly the international component of that. So yes, I certainly see a decline in China's economic output, not a lack of will to achieve a high output, but kind of a realization that the rate of development has probably exceeded what was sustainable and durable, and they've backed off of supporting development at that higher pace in the past, and therefore the kind of the downgrade, if you will, still a very strong result, but the downgrade in the economic forecast.
Oh, is China a sort of a cuckoo in the coal mine for the rest of us? It has been, in some ways, through this COVID journey, ahead of the OECD countries, the Western economies as they recover. And this idea of rebound versus recovery, the China has clearly rebounded. Once you turn all the engines back on, you just get a certain amount of momentum and growth. Do you think that is likely to repeat in the US, in Europe, the idea of a rebound rather than a recovery? I mean, the Fed still sitting on their hands would indicate that they're still not 100% confident that this is indeed a robust recovery that is sustainable.
Well, first of all, Sean, I would kind of look at the rebound characterization of China a little bit differently. COVID's not over in this country. I just completed a 2-week tour around Beijing and Guangzhou, which are two of the cities that were very, very definitely in the core of the infection. The level of security and control, health control, identification, confirmation, and many layers of bureaucracy that have been added to accomplish that, make the whole situation very, very tense for travelers in China today. So there's clearly a strong concern in the country about resurgence of the virus. And that's affecting kind of people's outlook here in the short term to medium term. So the recovery, yes, has undoubtedly been robust compared to last year, but there's also kind of an element of control and conservation in determining how China emerges. What can the US do? I actually expect a recovery rather than a rebound. I don't see the elements of a rebound yet in the US economic performance. And there is still a concern that the Delta variant could produce a second round of economic decline within the US until it's fully out of the woods. There's certainly a strong contribution of vaccinations, both the chemistry and the quality, and the trust in vaccinations that's impacting not only the US, but China as well.
Right.
So this is, viruses of this sort we all believed a year ago could be mitigated within 2 to 3 months and everything's back to normal. If you look at the history of viruses, it's more like 6 to 10 years. So, I mean, I think we're ahead of that here on the science side.
Well, we're getting into sort of looking, at least from an academic point of view, nearly into the third school year of disruption. Carole, the points on that, and then what we took out of the Fed yesterday, you suggested in your earlier comments that the Fed and perhaps other central bankers may need to take into consideration the impact of their decision on emerging economies. What is at stake for the Fed in delaying taking action at this point vis-a-vis their own economies, but also the emerging economies?
I mean, definitely they are looking at what is happening domestically before they look at what's happening elsewhere. And domestically, although the US has done an impressive job in terms of rolling out the vaccination just as soon as President Biden came to power and there was vaccine for everyone. But I think what's happening in the US today, the government is hitting a vaccine resistance wall. So there are more and more people who don't want to be vaccinated. I think this is where you're having this kind of problem of the spread of the Delta variant and maybe reintroduction of some restrictions in some areas. I was reading yesterday that they are reimposing wearing masks in some states indoors. So it's not just what the impact elsewhere. So first of all, there is domestically, they are not yet out of the woods, to borrow the expression of Albert, but also there is, you can look at other central banks, for example, in Europe, the European Central Bank, there seems to be some kind of maybe indirect coordination between their policies because they know that they cannot be left alone unless the rest of the world, the developing countries, really catch up to a certain point in terms of the vaccination rollout and the impact of, as you said, Sean, potentially increasing interest rate on the economies of these countries. And I think that's something that not many people are thinking about today because it's a problem that's going to emerge in the years to come. So it's not something that suddenly is going to go up and down like the oil inventories. And if I may say one more word about China to complement your question earlier, if you noticed, if you look at the 14th five-year plan published by the Chinese government not long time ago, you can see that for the first time, as far as I remember, they did not include a specific GDP growth rate target. And that by itself tells me that they are bracing themselves for a slower economic growth than what they witnessed in the previous years. And that is not only because of COVID, but because of problems they had before. So all in all, on balance, that even though we're going to finish hopefully from this pandemic nightmare, sooner than, for example, when we were talking about earlier this year, but now what we're seeing are structural problems emerging, and that will have a longer term impact than the pandemic itself on the global economy.
Dr. Aldo, sitting in Texas where you had 10,000 new infections reported statewide yesterday, the most since February, and over 5,000 hospitalizations in Texas, the most since February earlier this year. Clearly, there is a challenge from the resurgent COVID virus, but yet the state governor is saying there's absolutely no way we're going to intervene anymore. It's up to the people to make their own decisions every day on how to survive coexist with COVID. Is that going to impact demand on energy or not? Is it going to slow down people driving and all of the other things as we have to live and coexist with COVID? Your last comment seemed to indicate that demand is still vulnerable.
I think it's vulnerable, but we're seeing in Texas and in other places something that we could call lockdown fatigue syndrome, right? People do want to get out, and this is being reflected in what we're seeing in the pattern of demand for the summer. But this is also being reflected in the high-speed increase in contagions, and this is not only a Texas phenomenon. We're seeing quite a spike just across the border in Mexico, and it is a very very surprising rise in my view, how fast this is developing. It's also a different age group that is getting much more what's the word,
infected.
Exactly. So this will also have a different type of impact over the demand for transportation fuels. And I'm saying it like this because one thing that is not being mentioned enough, I believe, in our focus on energy markets is that, on the other hand, what's going on with natural gas is a very interesting story. The rise of US LNG exports is very telling of also the type of shift in demand patterns that we're seeing as more countries are focusing on sustainability and potential substitutes and the like. But to go back to your question, yes, I am very, I'm not prepared to say that demand will recuperate anytime soon, given these indications that we are seeing.
It's interesting in Texas as we go into an election year next year. The governor is up for election, Governor Abbott, and he's been attacked on the right for being essentially too soft, if you like, for imposing COVID restrictions during the height of the pandemic. That now politically is seen as a weakness. It'll be interesting. We go into the election cycle in the U.S. in the coming months after the summer for 2022. That being weak on COVID, if you are being having an austerity mandate on closing things down on COVID, will be seen as a weakness in political circles. Do you think that's going to impact where this goes?
Probably, but you know, it's what's more puzzling is a broader pattern, right? That the resistance to the vaccine and vaccination in many different countries, that's a very strange phenomenon. And I think what's strangest is that it has become this type of political banner that you're referring to, and that it is making this very sharp divide between conservatives and the left in many different countries. So we'll see how this plays out. If it continues like that, it's going to complicate even more the management of that.
I mean, it is worth noting that as successful as America's United States vaccination program has been, still only 50% of the population is fully vaccinated in the United States. That leaves a lot of people still exposed. Albert, getting back to the basics of sort of import demand into China, we saw a number of typhoons recently off the coast of Shanghai. Any expectations for further disruptions infrastructurally, if you like, to importing of energy into China?
Not the weather per se. There was one kind of low impact typhoon that moved across Shanghai last week. The Chinese are now modulating their currency exchange rate again, right? And have been since the beginning of this year, when it fell from about 7 per US dollar to 6.33 at the low. There was an effort by the Chinese to test the demand of Chinese consumers for foreign goods, attempt to rebalance trade by making foreign goods a bit cheaper for the Chinese. That, among other factors, didn't work as anticipated. Now the exchange rate is back to 6.5. The Chinese, as you know, peg their currency to the US dollar, for better or worse, and continue to move that peg as it suits them. But it's an important indicator of the domestic view here in China of the role of manufacturing in the export trade and the demand for foreign demand for Chinese manufactured goods. That they are now weakening the yuan again to try to catch some of the decline in foreign trade that resulted from their efforts to test the exchange rate.
Carole, the situation in Europe this summer, the sort of summer of recovery, the travel season is underway. Clearly, all the European countries have signed on to the travel passport. Does that look like it's delivering the results everybody wanted? We saw overnight that the UK is now going to accept European Union travel without the vaccination or without quarantine requirements. So maybe finally you can return to your beautiful apartment in London. What's the outlook, you think, for Europe's recovery through this summer?
Actually, I am more looking forward to seeing my hairdresser in London. Our thinking here in Europe, definitely things are looking better. So when you go down, let's say, to some cities, life is pretty normal, almost, except that people wear masks, etc. But overall, Sean, remember only a few months ago, everybody was talking about a pent-up demand this summer. Well, we're just about to start the last months of the summer. And where is that pent-up demand? It seems it has been delayed further. So while you're seeing this kind of gradual opening up, and I'm really thrilled that now they are relaxing the travel rules for vaccinated people. But remember, majority of the people around the world have not been vaccinated yet. So this raises the issue of equity, of further complications of the rules. And here in Germany, we haven't heard the end of the story yet, because they are maybe passing on new legislation about whoever comes, irrespective of their vaccination status, they have to prove, let's say, take some negative test, etc. So it's still a work in progress, and that would translate into further delaying of the pent-up demand. I was looking at the oil demand data from the latest last oil monthly reports. You can see that neither OPEC nor the IEA changed their demand forecast, even though OPEC was telling us that the demand outlook is getting better and better, but they did not upgrade their demand forecast, where the EIA actually downgraded it. So I feel that even though you have the sense that things are moving in the right direction in some parts of the world, elsewhere we're not seeing this kind of boost that is needed to support demand growth. So this is really my take about how things are going in Europe, slowly but surely, but not really translating into pent-up demand, especially when it comes to traveling around.
Well, let's go to the survey question before we ask our panelists to give us their views on how this August holiday month will impact the energy markets. Everybody running to the beach or not, staying at their desks. The question we have this morning is, will declining inventories below the 5-year average propel Brent to $80 a barrel by the end of Q3 or sometime before? I mean, clearly the inventory numbers are starting to be sizable. The OPEC decision ensures the market remains undersupplied. So there's only one thing that can happen, is continued inventory decline. So your thoughts on that? Is this enough to get we're now above 75. We've been here before. Will this momentum continue to $80 at this tightness in the market? Aldo, obviously we're coming in, at least globally, mostly Europe, I suppose. America never seems to shut down 24/7 sort of place, but nonetheless, August, the holiday season, typically traders, bankers, the financial system does take a bit of a timeout, whether you choose to participate in it or not. How do you think that will affect the momentum of a number of these trend issues that we're facing at the moment?
I don't know.
Aldo, I don't know.
I don't know. I am still very intrigued by the latest news. I think there's a shift in sentiment over the last 2 weeks as news began to accumulate about this Delta variant.
You're saying that from in the U.S. perspective.
Correct.
I mean, clearly the numbers in Texas are quite big in the surge of the new infection rates, but yet the political opposition to do anything about it seems increasingly robust as well.
Yes, and it has many people dumbfounded. You probably saw the news today that even the leader of the Republican wing, Mitch McConnell in the Senate, was saying that he didn't expect this type of opposition. So how will this play out through demand patterns? I'm only wondering.
Yeah, it certainly will be interesting, particularly in America, given that it is the engine of that's sort of leading the train of recovery. And if it was to stutter, because a lot of that is baked into the price. Albert, in China, clearly not on the same cycle as the rest of the world, but nonetheless, the efforts to stimulate the economy, the momentum that it needs from a demand centers for its own products, as you indicated, could we expect a sort of a slowdown in China through August?
Well, one of the things we haven't discussed here about China is tourism, the importance of tourism to the Chinese economy. Right? Just the same as Europe, for that matter.
Well, Chinese tourists to Europe that were pre-COVID massive.
And here's the conflict. China, as we discussed earlier, or previous call, has effectively closed its borders through summer of 2022. But there's something of a litmus test coming up in the wintertime when China intends to host the 2022 Winter Olympics. So how they host the Winter Olympics while the borders are closed is kind of an interesting conundrum. And the borders are closed to Chinese tourists, right? to the exit of Chinese citizens abroad. As opposed to business travel, permitted business travel, political travel, military exchanges, all of those things. But tourism covers a very broad category of travel, not just to look at the sights and stand in front of the Mona Lisa, but to take jobs abroad as well. So all that has been embargoed until at least summer next year. And
travel within China right now, we've seen in the US, despite Dr. Aldo's somewhat uncertain outlook, aviation travel in America has more or less returned to near normal levels, still a little bit shy perhaps on business class travel internally, not so much out of the country, but nonetheless internally. What about in China, Albert, internal travel?
Sean, very robust year in China. Flights are full in almost every instance. Very few seats on domestic flights remain open. Trains are full. So there is plenty of internal demand for travel.
Interesting. Let's get the survey result to give Dr. Carole the last word this morning, and the last show of the year, of July. Will declining inventories below 5-year average propel Brent to $80 a barrel by the end of Q3? 59% yes, 41% no. Carole, your thoughts of for August coming, 29th of July, the momentum into the summer clearly becomes a period when cyclically, at least from the point of the financial markets, tend to take a time out.
Yeah, first of all, I find it hard to really believe, and I touched on that before with discussions earlier with you, Sean, about the issue of tight market. That was perhaps a prominent discussion maybe a month ago or 2 months ago, but you see from various publications, including those coming from what I call the bulls of Wall Street, you find that the tone has changed. So it's kind of softened. The fear of market tightness has kind of eased. Maybe it's not going to ease overnight because you do have, for example, in some countries such as the Middle East, domestic demand for oil increases because of the heat summer period. And there it's the only region in the world where they burn oil for power generation to cool their home. So there will always be pockets of where you have kind of cyclical or seasonal increase in demand. But overall, the kind of perception that I find today dominating markets is not really the same heated, strong fears about tightness of markets, at least in this quarter of the year. Now, things don't look any brighter next year, especially if we're talking about the second half of next year. And I know it's a long way to go before then. But again, if you look at some publications, some forecasts, there seem to be an agreement, and this is something that we did not discuss today, that is a supply coming to the market. So it's not just the OPEC plus supply coming to the market. There is US shale coming back to the market, US production general, and production coming from elsewhere, that you see even downgrade in oil price forecasts for next year. But maybe we leave that discussion if you keep on going until we catch up in August 2022 to make a recap.
Well, we will have Mike Muller and Christoph Ruhl on Sunday, August 1st, to give us their sense of where the markets may go through the holiday month of August. But before then, I'd like to just thank Dr. Albert, great to have you join us. And Dr. Carole, as always, thank you very much for your time. Whatever you're doing in August, have a great break. We'll be here next week every morning at 10:30 UAE time. All the best. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Cheers, guys.